What's up, y'all? Welcome back to my channel, or if you're new here, hello and welcome. I have the new Runaway Princess palette from Qianyan to share with y'all today, and I am so incredibly excited about this one. This is a stunning palette. Is she a little boring and basic? Absolutely, but personally, I love a good neutral palette. Now, if you are unfamiliar with Qianyan or Cheer Up, they are a C beauty brand, and they have an incredible formula. I do have two other palettes from the brand, one of which I have already thoroughly tested and reviewed for y'all here on my channel, and the other one is coming very soon in upcoming videos, so make sure you keep your eyes peeled for that one. But I noticed whenever this palette was revealed, it looked very similar to something else I already had in my collection, and that is none other than the I Need a Nude palette from Natasha Denona. So look at these two side by side and tell me that I am wrong. They are very similar to one another, and in fact, they look even more similar in person than they do on camera. But once I actually got this in my hands and got a better look at it, I noticed it looked very similar to something else that I have in my collection, and that is none other than the Golden palette from Natasha Denona. So again, looking at these two side by side, they are very similar, and in fact, when you look at these three palettes together, I will pop up a picture so you can get a good visual. This is the perfect mashup of the two from Natasha Denona. So today we are going to do some side-by-side swatches, comparisons, and then we're going to create a look on one eye with the Qianyan palette and a combination of the two Natasha Denonas on the other eye, and see how similar these palettes actually are to one another. Now, before we get into the fun stuff, I do want to give y'all all the details, close-ups, and standalone swatches of each of these palettes, just so you can see what we're working with in today's video. So up first, we have the Runaway Princess palette from Qianyan. This is absolutely beautiful. Now, this is a 16 pan palette. It does retail for $37.99, and this one is like the perfect mashup of cool tones and warm tones. I love the selection of mattes and the selections of shimmers in here. Absolutely stunning. Our first Natasha Denona palette is going to be the I Need a Nude palette. This one came out around this time last year. This is a 15 pan palette, and this one retails for $69. Now, this one is very neutral, but it does have some pops of cooler tones in it. Again, I really enjoy this palette. I like the matte formula, I like the shimmer formula, and this one is beautiful, and it's a very popular one from Natasha Denona. And our second Natasha Denona palette is going to be the Golden palette. This one came out earlier this year, and this one is very pretty. It is very neutral leaning. It does have those pops of golds and some warmth in it, but this one is another 15 pan palette. It does retail for $69, and I do really enjoy this one, even though this one is a little bit more on the boring side compared to the other two palettes. Now, I do want to mention that all three of these palettes are still currently available on their respective websites, so I will have them all linked and listed down below in the description box, as well as everything on my face and everything I use to complete these looks today. So per usual, if you're ever curious about anything I use in any of my videos here on my channel, always check the description box. I squeeze as much information as I possibly can into that tiny little space. But let's go ahead and switch to an overhead view and start swatching these palettes out next to each other. Alright, before we jump into the actual swatches of these palettes, I did want to give you one more close-up side by side of the three of them, just so you could see how similar they actually are to one another. Now, I am not saying in any way that this is a dupe for the two from Natasha Denona, because they are very different formulas. All I am saying is that this palette is giving off a very similar vibe to what we have going on in the two from Natasha Denona. So if you have been maybe eyeing one or both of these palettes and you can't decide which one to get because you really want both and you just can't bring yourself to spend the $140 that it would be for regular price, this could be a really good option. Now, we will discuss formulas and all of that at the end of the video, but I just wanted to kind of point that out really quick. But if you look at this side of the Runaway Princess, there is a lot of similarities to the I Need a Nude palette, especially when it comes to these four mattes and these three shimmers right here. There's also some similarities with this one right here. This one is a little bit more pink tone. This is just me kind of eyeballing it. We'll see whenever we actually start to swatch it out. Now, you are going to get more pinky tones from this palette up here, but if you're really just going for these more kind of neutral, cool tone leaning shades, this could be a really good option. But then if you come over here and compare this side of the palette, there's a lot of similarities. So you have this gold shade right here that kind of correlates to that one, this really pretty white shimmer that's very similar to that one, and then again, the mattes in here are very similar to what we have going on over here. Now, we're going to go ahead and jump into the swatches. I'm going to start with the one from Qianyan, and then we'll do our comparison swatches with these two palettes right here. All right, to swatch this palette out, I am going to go top to bottom, left to right, all the way across. There's not any shade names in the Qianyan palette, so I'm just going to give you the best description that I possibly can of the actual shades, but that's how we're going to swatch this out just in case you're following along. So we're going to start with this shade up here. This is a really pretty white shimmer shade. It looks like it has a little bit of like a white, yellow, green flip to it, and I'm going to go ahead and start by swatching this one out right here. I'm just going to stick to the 1/2 of my wrist so we can kind of pull out the comparisons from the other two, but that is absolutely beautiful. It is so sparkly, it's so smooth. It has a really nice creamy feeling to it. I really love that shade. Our next shade is going to be this really pretty sort of bronze shimmer shade. So I'm going to swipe this one right here. I'm going to give a little bit of space for comparison, but that is that shade. So it doesn't have any flips or anything like that to it, but again, it is very smooth and very reflective. All right, this is going to be our first matte in the palette, and this is a very mid-tone warm brown shade. It has a little bit of that peachy undertone to it. Absolutely beautiful. It was so smooth and so soft and creamy in the pan, and it swatched out beautifully. Obviously, swatches don't tell the whole story, because I will tell you now, Natasha Denona does not always swatch out the best, but performance-wise on the eye, that is what matters, and I never have an issue with Natasha Denona shades. But let's go ahead and pop into this one right here, which is going to be another matte shade. This is also a very mid-tone brown, but this one has a little bit more of a neutrality to it. Not quite as much warmth. I mean, it is a little bit more on the warm side compared to a true neutral, but when you're looking at this one right here, it doesn't quite have as much warmth to it. Next, we have this absolutely beautiful gold shimmer shade, and that is incredibly reflective and sparkly. Again, nice and smooth. It's not quite opaque. It has a little bit more of that sheer base to it, but it doesn't feel chunky or anything like that. Next, we have this shade right here, which is sort of that white and gold striped shade. Now, this one is coming off a little bit more on that gold champagne side. Very translucent base. That would be a beautiful topper or inner corner shade. Now, our next matte in the palette has a little bit of sparkle to it. So whenever you kind of pack it on, you'll see a little bit more of that shimmer, but if you really blow it out, you're not going to see it. But that is a really pretty light peach tone neutral shade. And then the last matte that we have on this little side of the palette is this really pretty warm tone, mid-tone shade. Again, there's not a whole lot of depth when it comes to this side. Your depth is all going to be on this side of the palette, but I am going to stop here as far as swatches go because I want to compare this part of the palette to the golden palette. So this is what we have going on from the warmer side of the palette. Very pretty. I do like the shade selection, and the shimmers are absolutely beautiful, but let's go ahead and pop into the golden palette. All right, so this is what we're looking like side by side. So I'm gonna go ahead and start to pull the ones that look very similar, and then we'll see what else we can match up. So I'm gonna start with this shade right here, which is called Oro. It's this really pretty gold shimmer shade, and this one looks very similar to this one right here from Qianyan. I don't think they're gonna be spot on, but they definitely have that same kind of vibe. So the one from Natasha Denona has a little bit more of like a solid base to it. It's not quite as sheer and translucent as the one from Qianyan, but you can see it's definitely giving off that same vibe. So if this is a little too intense for you, this one might be a really good option. But I do also want to kind of swatch out this one and this one as well and see if they have a little bit of similar properties to it as that one does. This one might be a little bit more on like the bronzy side compared to it. This one is called Aurum. I couldn't read that kind of side by side. So that one definitely has a little bit more of like that copper greeny base to it. Not really similar to anything else that we have swatched out thus far, but I still wanted to show it to you. But we're going to go into the shade up here, which is called Fizzy. This one has a little bit more of like that same kind of coppery base to it, but it's a little bit more on the translucent side. It's a little bit more sheer, so it's not quite as intense as what we have going on in these two shades, but it's also not as gold as this one right here. All right, so the next one that I want to go to is this one right here, which is called Aura. And this one I want to swatch out next to this shade up here because I think they are very similar. So let me get a really good swatch of that one on my finger. And I'm going to put this one right here. Now those two are very, very similar. I don't know how well y'all can see that if the light's gonna pick it up. Let me see if I can do a better swatch, just because this is kind of an odd angle. So there you go. Those are those two shades right next to each other. Now the one from Natasha Denona has very similar flips to this one, but the one from Qianyan has so much more sparkle to it than the one from Natasha Denona. Personally, it comes down to your personal preference. They are both very smooth, very creamy. I like this one better because I like more of that sparkle, but this one could definitely be a little bit more on the subtle side, still very pretty. All right, as far as this shade right here goes, I want to compare it to this one, which is called Nubia. So let me go ahead and pick this one up on my finger really well, and we're going to swatch these out. I think these two might be the most similar so far. Oh yeah, absolutely. This one has a little bit more of a solid base to it, and this one is a little bit more sheer, and it has a lot more sparkle to it, but they are very, very similar to one another. So far, like I said, the two most similar shades in these palettes. Now, as far as this shade right here goes, I don't think we have anything similar to that one in this palette, but I am going to go ahead and swatch out the shade Kava next to it and see how it looks, because this one has a little bit more of that sparkle to it. I just don't think the undertones are going to be the same, and they absolutely are not. This one has a little bit more of that gold flip to it, and this one is a little bit more champagne-y, but on the eye, I think they would be very similar. They're still going to give off the same vibe. All right, let's go ahead and move on to the mattes. So we have 4 shades right here, and I think I'm gonna go ahead and start with this one right here because I think it's gonna be very similar to the shade Panna. I think that's how you pronounce it. I can't always say the shades in Natasha Denona palettes for some reason, but this one is very neutral. It's very light. It doesn't have that sparkle to it like the one in Qianyan has, but it is still very similar in tone. You can see that this one is just like the slightest bit lighter, but not enough to make a huge difference. It also, like I said, doesn't have that sparkle to it, but that is those two shades next to each other. And then let's see what else we have. I'm wondering if this one, which is called Teak, is going to be similar to this matte shade over here. So let's go ahead and start by swatching out that one. Very similar. The shade Teak does have a little bit more neutrality to it. It's not quite as red undertoned as the one in the Runaway Princess palette is, but still, again, that same vibe once you get it on the eye and you start to blend it out a little bit. All right, so that brings us down to these two shades right here, and I don't think we have anything in this palette that is really going to match up with those two. I think these two shades are going to be found more in the I Need a Warm palette. I do have that one, but I didn't bring it out because it just wasn't nearly as similar, but again, that could be a really good option. But let's go ahead and kind of check out the shade Flesh, see if maybe it's going to have a little similarity to either of these. Maybe this one right here might be closer than I think it's gonna be. Actually, that is very close. The one in the Qianyan palette, again, has a little bit more warmth to it, a little bit more of that peachy tone, but again, once you get on the eye, I don't think you're gonna have that much of a difference. Now this shade back here, I really don't see anything in here that's gonna be similar. We have this shade right here, which is the only other kind of mid-tone matte, and you can see it looks very like yellowy next to this shade over here because of the undertones. And then the last matte that we have is gonna be the shade Log, and that one's going to be a lot darker. So I mean, out of all of these, we have a lot of very similar shades between the two palettes. Obviously, they are not one-for-one dupes for each other, but you're still going to get that same vibe. But I'm going to go ahead and remove this, and we're going to swatch out the other half of the Qianyan palette and compare that one to the I Need a Nude palette. All right, so we're gonna start swatching this little cool tone section of the palette over here. So I'm gonna start up here with this shimmer shade, which is very, very pretty. This one has a little bit more of that taupey undertone to it. Not quite a silver, more like a pewter shade. And I'm gonna swatch this one right here. Oh, that is absolutely stunning. I love the way that shade looks. All right, so next we have this really pretty light neutral vanilla shade, very similar to my skin tone. I hope you can see it on camera, but this would be a really good like inner corner shade, blending out shade, lightening up shade, things like that. But let's go ahead and move on to this shade right here. This one is more of like a taupey shade. It definitely has a little bit more neutrality to it. This whole side of this palette does. That one is really pretty. That's a nice neutral taupey brown shade right there. All right, we have come to our first deep matte shade of the palette. This one is really pretty. It has the slightest bit of warmth to it, but for the most part, it is a very neutral brown shade. Next, we have this really pretty shimmer shade. Now this one looks like it's almost a true silver, but again, it has a little bit more of like that champagne-y undertone to it. It's once again a translucent base. It has a lot of like shimmer to it, but it doesn't feel chunky or heavy. It doesn't feel like a pressed glitter. It feels very smooth whenever I pick it up. Our next matte shade is going to be a true taupe shade. At least this is what I think of whenever I think of the shade taupe. It has more of that neutral undertone to it, almost leaning towards like the gray cool tone side, but not so close to that it's like a true gray shade. At least not on my skin tone, it's not. And here we have our last shimmer in this palette. This one looks like it's going to be a little bit more on like that pinky undertone side. You can see that little bit of coolness that it has to it, but it has like a nice little flip to it. I don't know if it's necessarily like a duochrome, but it definitely has a little bit of that pinky base going on to it. And the last shade in this palette is going to be this really pretty deep brown shade. It's sort of like a blackened brown. It has a lot more of a cool undertone to it, but it has just enough of that warmth to it. It's not quite a gray shade. All right, so this is what our swatches look like next to the I Need a Nude palette, and I can definitely see a lot more similarities going on right here than there were with the golden side of the palette. But let's go ahead and start comparing some of these shades. We're gonna start with the obvious ones and then we'll kind of dwindle down from there. So I'm gonna go ahead and start with this shade right here, which is called Fair, and I'm gonna compare it to this kind of vanilla shade over here. Now Fair does have a little bit more of a pinky undertone to it, but again, we're going for the vibe of the palette. We're not trying to dupe these out because they are not 100% dupes, but you can see swatched out next to each other, this one definitely has more cool undertone to it, whereas this one is more just a very neutral run-of-the-mill vanilla shade. But once you get them on the eye, especially depending on your undertone, you're still gonna have that same kind of vibe going on. All right, so next we're gonna move on to the darkest shade in the palette, which is Silhouette right here. And I'm gonna compare it to our darkest shade in the Qianyan palette. So this one definitely has more of that cool undertone to it. And I think these are going to be really similar to one another. So let's go ahead and swatch them out and see what they do. Oh yeah, that is very similar. Now you see what I was talking about when I said that Natasha Denona doesn't always swatch out very well. It looks a little patchy, but performance-wise, the formula in here is beautiful. But that is a very similar tone. This one has just the slightest bit more warmth to, or coolness to it, not warmth, I'm sorry, coolness to it than this one does over here, but overall still very close to one another. Okay, let's go ahead and move on, and I think what I want to swatch out next is maybe this shade right here called Mesh. I'm kind of thinking maybe it's going to be a little similar to this one right here. So let's see what we've got going on. Now this one, okay, is not very similar at all. It's kind of hard to do this because some of these look so different in the pan than they actually look when you swatch them out. Again, this one has more of that kind of cool undertone to it than this one does over here. Actually, they're both very cool, but this one has more of a pinky undertone to it. But let's swatch out the shade Tender and see what that's gonna look like next to this one. My mouth is getting ahead of everything else. Now I think that one is more similar to that shade right here. So I probably should have swatched those two out next to one another. Yeah, these two shades are very similar. This one's not really so similar to anything in here, but let's keep going on. So we're gonna do, I don't really see any similarities with these two shades in this palette. I think these two actually might be in the golden palette. So maybe we'll flip back over to that one in just a few minutes and see if we can find similar shades in there. But let's go ahead and do Sheen with this shade right here. I want to see if they're very similar to one another. So that is the shade Sheen on my finger. And next to this shade right here, not very similar. This one is more, again, on the neutral side, and this one has more of that warmth to it, but I do see a lot of similarities with these two shades right here. So let's go ahead and put that one next to this shade up here. Yeah, definitely. This one has a stronger like flip and base to it than this one does over here. But if I'm looking at it in person, they are very similar to one another. This one's just a little bit different on camera than it is in person, but still very pretty. Let's go ahead and swatch out the shade Muse, which is this one right here. I love this shade. It is so incredibly pretty. And I think this one is going to be very similar to this shade down here. Yes, absolutely. This one has a little bit more of that taupey base to it, but this one is very similar as far as depth goes, and this one has a little bit more of that flip to it as well. Let's do the shade Delilah next to this shade down here on my wrist. So these two shades right here, yeah, that one's gonna be a lot more similar to this shade than this one is right here. See, that's what I love about doing these swatches, is that you look at them in the pan and you think, oh, that's going to look very similar, but then you swatch it out and you're like, oh, maybe not, because now that I'm looking, this shade right here is a good match for this one up here. So let's go ahead and swatch out Muse again and put it up here next to this shimmer. Yeah, those two are very, very similar. They have a lot of the same depth, the same undertone, a little bit of that same flip going on. Okay, so far we've got these two, these, and these that are very similar to one another. But we do still have these two mattes right here. And again, I just don't think there's gonna be anything in this palette. So let me go ahead and bring back out the golden palette. All right, so here we are back at the golden palette, and I definitely see some more similarities over here, and I'm wondering if Aria or Sandstone is going to be similar to this shade. So I'm going to go ahead and start by picking up both of them on my finger and kind of seeing what we have. So this is the shade Aria. That one is very similar. Aria has a little bit more of that peachy undertone to it than the one from Qianyan, but the other shade is Sandstone, and I think this one is going to be more similar as well. Again, this one has a little bit more of that yellow to it, and this one is definitely looking more cool tone compared to these two shades, but this is a more cool tone side of the palette, and this one is a lot more warm tone, but we definitely have like a similar vibe going on. But last, let's pop into the shade Log right here and see how similar it's gonna be to this shade. Depth-wise, those are very similar. There is the slightest bit more warmth in this shade over here than there is in this one, which makes me laugh because this palette leans very warm, but when you swatch it out next to that one, it looks very neutral, but still very similar. So I think we have a lot of similarities as far as these two palettes go. I don't think that the one from Qianyan really lines up with any one palette from the Natasha Denona line, but again, if maybe you're eyeballing several of them and you're wishing that maybe this one had something that this one didn't have, this could be a good option. But let's go ahead and start creating our looks with these palettes. Okay, so I zoomed y'all in just a little bit. My eyes are primed with my MAC paint pot. Let's start creating these two looks. So I'm gonna create one look with the Qianyan palette on my right eye over here. And then on my left eye, I'm gonna create a very similar look with the two from Natasha Denona, at least as close as I can possibly get. I'm gonna kind of flip back and forth between the two palettes. So I'm not gonna do one eye and then the other. We're gonna do kind of a side-by-side comparison as we go. So let's go ahead and start with the Qianyan palette. So First, I think I'm going to go into this vanilla shade right here. This one's probably not going to show up on my skin, but like I said, I want to try and use as many of the shades as I possibly can to create this look. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that up with a Morphe M506 brush, and I'm just going to start to fluff this into my crease. So nothing fancy, nothing crazy. Like I said, you're probably not even going to really see this on my eye. And as far as like patching and skipping and fallout goes, we're not going to know because it is very similar, but we're just going to kind of start this look off right here with this shade. Alright, so from the Natasha Denona I Need a Nude palette, I'm going to go into this shade right here, which is called Fair. From now on, I'm just going to call this the Nude palette, and then we're going to have the Gold palette, and then we'll have the Qianyan palette. That way I don't have to keep repeating the names of all these palettes. But we're going to go into this shade right here, which is called Fair. I'm picking it up with a Game Beauty EO6 brush, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the first look. I'm just going to start to fluff this into my crease, bringing it up towards my brow bone. Again, this is very similar to my skin tone. In fact, this one is closer to my skin tone than the other one, and you can see that this eye over here is already looking a little bit brighter, and this one is just looking very neutral, very close to my same skin tone. Alright, so next we're going to go into this shade down here. This one is a little bit more on the neutral side. I don't want to take this look too cool or too neutral. I kind of want to do something right down the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that shade up with a Refer 15 brush. And I'm going to put this one into the crease of my eye, just kind of fluffing it over and up a little bit, building up that actual depth and definition. And look at how easy that went on, how easy it blended out. I'm not getting any patching or skipping. I'm not getting any fallout down here. This is a very easy to work with formula, and so far I have really been enjoying this brand. Now coming over to the Gold palette, I'm going to go into the shade Teak, and I'm going to do the same thing that I just did on my other eye, and I'm going to pick this one up with a Refer 27 brush. So we're going to pick that up, and again, we're just going to kind of press this in and fluff this into the crease of my eye, bringing it up and out over towards the inner corner. Exact same technique. There's going to be a lot of repetition with these two looks. Now as I'm putting this shade on, I can already tell it's not quite as pigmented as the one from Qianyan, so that little dip in that I did isn't going as far as it did from the other palette. I am still not having any patching, skipping, or fallout. It is blending out absolutely beautiful. So far we're kind of neck and neck as far as formula goes with the mattes in here. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and pop into this shade down here, and for that I'm going to go ahead and pick it up with a Refer 01 brush, and I'm just going to start to build up a little bit more depth in that outer corner over here. So just right here, I'm going to kind of smudge it up into that crease and just kind of fluff everything out, blend everything out, and deepen up this look. Now with this one, again, no more fallout, very pigmented, very easy to work with. I do think I want to go back with that other shade though that I used first, and I just kind of want to reiterate it just a little bit. So I'm going to go back in with that same brush that I used for that shade and just kind of bring it over a little bit further and kind of bring it up a little bit more, and I'll do the same thing on the other side as well. Alright, so I already went in and put on more of that shade from this palette that I did in my crease. So next we're going to go into this shade down here from the Gold palette. This one is called Log. So I'm actually going to pick this one up with a Refer 02 brush, and we're just going to kind of do the same thing that I did in the other look. I'm going to put this into my outer corner, bring it up into my crease, kind of blend everything together and add that extra depth out here. Next, we're going to go into this deep shade right here, and I'm just going to deepen up this outer corner just the slightest bit. So I'm going to pick that up with a Refer 26 brush, and I'm just going to put this in the very outer corner of my lid. I'm also going to bring it down to the very outer portion of my lower lash line as well. I haven't really gotten into that lower lash line yet, but we're going to go ahead and start here, and then we'll kind of disperse it and fluff it out with something else. But this is what we are looking like so far. Very similar from side to side. I still need to deepen up this outer corner over here, but To deepen up the other side, we're going to go into the shade right here from the Nude palette. This one is called Silhouette. I'm going to pick that one up with a Rephr 03 brush, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the other look. So just very tightly right here in the outer corner, bring it down onto my lower lash line and just blend everything together. All right, so for the rest of the lower lash line, I want to go into this shade right here, and I'm just going to fluff that down there. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that one up with my Singe Beauty EO3 brush. And like I said, we're just going to fluff this along my lower lash line, and then we'll go back and do the same on the other eye with one of the shades from those palettes. All right, so for the lower lash line on this eye, we're gonna go into this shade right here from the Nude palette, which is called Tender, and I'm gonna pick that one up with a Rephr 14 brush. And again, I'm just gonna do the same thing that I did on the other eye. So I'm just gonna fluff this right here along the lower lash line, blending everything over from outer corner to inner corner. All right, so this is what these two eye looks are looking like side by side, and they are very similar. I don't really think you can tell much of a difference. Maybe if you got up close, you could see a little bit of color discrepancy, but for the most part, this looks like I'm using the same shades on both eyes. But let me go ahead and prime my eyes with my NYX glitter primer so we can go ahead and put some sparkle on these lids. All right, so for all over the lid, I want to go in with this shade right here. This one has a little bit of like that peachy flip undertone to it. So I'm going to go ahead and pick this one up with my finger. Now, if you have not seen me use one of these palettes before, I do want to show you that my finger fits in here perfectly. It is just wide enough and long enough that I can get my finger in here so it's not too narrow. But I'm going to go ahead and pop this one all over my lid. Now, this one is nice and creamy. It has a little bit of like a wet feeling to it. I wouldn't say a putty feeling, but it is very smooth, very reflective. They go on beautiful on the lid, and I really, really love this shade. From the Nude palette, I'm going to go into this one right here, which is called Muse. This one was very similar to the one in the Qianyan palette, and I'm going to pop this all over the lid as well. Now, this one is looking a little bit more on that warm side compared to the one in the Qianyan palette, but again, we're just trying to get the same vibe. We're not trying to completely dupe out these palettes, but it is going on absolutely beautifully. I will say this one doesn't feel as creamy, and I don't want to say stiff. This one is just a little bit more tightly packed than the one from Natasha Denona. Basically, they're just two very different formulas. They both look very beautiful and reflective on the lid, both very smooth, but I will say I do think that this one is emphasizing a little bit more texture than this one is over here. And once I get the Natasha Denona one on my lid, it feels a little bit more on that powdery side compared to this one over here, but it is still absolutely beautiful and reflective on the lid. For the inner corner, I want to go into this shade up here. I'm going to try and keep these looks pretty simple as far as the amount of shades that I use and things like that. But I'm going to go ahead and pick this one up with a Morphe M421 brush. I am going to spray this with my MAC Fix Plus, and I'm just going to pop this into my inner corner. So there it is picked up on my brush. Let's give it a little spritz. And we're gonna pop this one right in here. I am gonna kind of bring it down onto the lower lash line, and I'm gonna bring it up onto the lid as well. And then from the gold palette, we're gonna go into this shade right here, which is called Aura. And I'm going to pick this one up with, what are you? A Morphe M213 brush. And I'm just gonna pop this one into my inner corner. So again, I am going to spray this with some MAC Fix Plus, just so it gives it a little bit more tack. Now, I will say that this one picks up a little, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? It picks up a little bit more on the brush than the other one, but it is going on really nicely as well. All right, y'all, so these are the two completed looks with these palettes, and I think they both turned out absolutely beautiful, and I think the looks are very similar to one another. There are some differences as far as formula goes, and we will get into that in just a few minutes, but before we do, I want to show you what I used to finish off these two looks, turn the lights down, show you all the shimmer, the sparkle, and all that jazz, and then we will get into my thoughts on these palettes. So with that being said, in my lower waterline, I went in with a Victoria Beckham Satin Kajal Liner in the shade Cinnamon. I lined my lids with my ZC Liquid Liner, and then finished everything off with my Charmacy mascara. All right, y'all, so let's go ahead and chat about these palettes, because while we do have a lot of similarities when it comes to the color stories, we do have some differences as far as the formula goes. Now, I do want to preface this by saying that this is all my personal opinion. This is just for fun. This is not meant to bad talk about either of these brands, because I do love both of these brands. I think they both have an incredible formula, and I would 100% recommend any of these palettes to you, no questions asked. But let's go ahead and lightly touch on the Natasha Denona palette. I'm just gonna hold up the one because formula wise it's pretty much the same thing. Now, this is a mainstream brand. She's been around for a while. I have several palettes from the brand. She is widely known and loved in the beauty community, and for good reason. She has a fantastic formula. Her mattes are pigmented. They are very easy to blend out and work with. I never get patching, skipping, fallout, creasing, fading, anything like that. She does have a really nice matte formula. Now, as far as the shimmers go, her shimmers can be a little more hit or miss. I do find that she has been a little bit more on the consistent side over the past maybe year and a half, 2 years, probably starting more so with her Yucca palette moving forward, but you do get lots of different formulas as far as her shimmers go. Some of them are a little bit more creamy, some of them are a little bit more textured, you get reflections, some of them have flips, some of them are a little bit more on the metallic side. So there are some inconsistencies when it comes to her shimmers, but I don't find any of them to be hard to pick up, put on the lid, or anything like that. And up until now, kind of giving a little foresight, I've never found that her shimmers accentuated texture, but I will say, looking at this eye compared to over here, I do feel like there is a little bit more texture on my lid, but like I said, I've never noticed that before. But let's move on to the Qianyan palette, because this is the one that we're really here for, and this is a brand that I am still getting to know and love and enjoy. I have played with one of their palettes before, and I will say, as far as formula goes, I do find it to be very consistent with the formula in here. The matte formula in these is incredible. They are extremely pigmented, very buttery to the touch, easy to pick up, easy to put on the lid. They blend out effortlessly, and I never get patching, skipping, fallout, creasing, fading, or anything like that. I find the matte formula in these palettes to be just a little bit more user-friendly than the ones in Natasha Denona. Sometimes I have to work just a smidge harder to blend them out, and I don't mean I have to sit here and work really hard, put in a lot of elbow grease. I'm just comparing it to this formula and over here. This one, you put it on and it practically blends out itself. Now, as far as the shimmers in here go, these are unmatched. These are incredibly like shifty and reflective and just beautiful on the lid, and I find these to be a little bit more of a thinner formula. Even though they have a little bit more like that wet feeling to them, they go on the lid thinner, so they're not going to accentuate texture. They're going to be a little bit more mature lid friendly. And like I said, if I compare the two eyes next to each other, well, this one over here, which is the Natasha Denona eye, looks absolutely beautiful compared to this one just looks a little bit smoother and a little bit more polished. Like I said, both formulas are incredible, but for me personally, if I had to choose one brand, I would go for the Qianyan palette over the Natasha Denona, not only because the formula is absolutely incredible, but you're getting a high quality formula for a fraction of the price from Natasha Denona. These retail for $69. That's over $70 with tax here in the US, and this one is $37.99. You cannot beat that for the quality that you get in here. Yes, it's a little bit smaller when you compare them side by side, but how many people actually like pan and go through an entire palette? Unless you are somebody who uses the exact same shades every single day, you're just not going to do it. So for me, for this video, we have to have a winner, and the winner is going to come down to the Qianyan palette for me. Now, before we close this out, I know this has been a little bit lengthy and I'm being a little long-winded. I did want to pull out the other two palettes that I mentioned to kind of show you a side by side. We're not going to do swatches and all that. It's just going to be a quick visual. So let me go ahead and hold up the Runaway Princess palette. And then I also have the I Need a Warm palette from Natasha Denona. Now, I have not played with this one yet. I picked it up. I had some points at Ulta and it ended up being free, and I couldn't resist because I saw this one in person and it's so much prettier in person than it is online. But you can definitely see there's some similarities when it comes to the mattes in here. Not so much the shimmer shades, but definitely more of the matte shades. But the other one that I wanted to compare it to is the Natasha Denona Denona Glam palette. Now this one is a little bit older, especially in my collection, and it's not a favorite. The shimmers in here just aren't as punchy as what she does now, but you can definitely see some of those similarities as far as colors go compared to the two palettes. So like I said, I just wanted to show y'all a quick side by side. The main point of this was to show you that you can get some beautiful looks from this palette right here. But that is going to complete this video. I hope y'all enjoyed it. Let me know all of your thoughts down below. I want to know it all. I want to know if you have any of these palettes. Are you a Natasha Denona fan? Do you plan on picking up this palette? What do you think of the two looks side by side? What did you think of this video? I want to know it all. Let's have that conversation. Light up that comment section. And as usual, I want to thank you all so much for watching my video and spending your time with me. It truly does mean so much to me. And if you like this video, make sure you give it a big thumbs up before you leave. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and click on that notification bell so that you can be notified of all my future posts here on my channel. I do post quite a few videos every single week and I wouldn't want you to miss one. But until my next video, have a good one. Bye.